Go ahead. Wa alaikum salam. Okay, brother's question concerning niqab or the face veil, is this a must and a requirement for Muslim women? Well, this is an issue over which Muslim scholars have differed. Some hold that it is not an obligation, but those who hold it's not an obligation hold that it is a strong recommendation. And others hold that it is an obligation. You do have an element amongst modernists who would even go so far as to claim that it isn't an obligation at all. Even the khimar or the scarf itself, but this is something cultural, and that modesty is only a principle and an idea that can vary from society to society, and as long as you maintain what may be classified as modesty, you're okay. So if you're in the West, what constitutes modesty, which might constitute nakedness in the Muslim world, is okay, you know. But this is, of course, an extreme view which steps outside of the bounds of Islamic law. An Egyptian scholar stated that France is permitted to pass a law banning hijab. Muslims should move to Muslim countries. What is your view, especially for Muslims whose home is in the West? Well, whether France is permitted to or not, that is up to them. Of course, it's their country, they can do what they want to do in the country. But it is something which may be fought legally, because there are also people from various areas of human rights who have actually opposed this. There is an article which is available on the internet, written by one of the big human rights organizations, in which they recommend, that they call on France actually to take this back. Human Rights Watch. They said the proposed law is an unwarranted infringement on the right to religious practice, said Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. For many Muslims, wearing a headscarf is not only about religious expression, it is about religious obligation. He has understood the crux of the matter. He said some supporters of the proposed law, known as the draft law concerning the application of the principle of secularism in schools, junior high schools and high schools, which would come into force in September, believe it is necessary to uphold the separation of church and state in education, and to protect the secular state from the perceived threat of religious fundamentalism, particularly Islamic fundamentalism. However, protecting the rights of all students to religious freedom does not undermine secularism in schools. On the contrary, it demonstrates respect for religious diversity, a position fully consistent with maintaining the strict separation of public institutions from any particular religious message. Human Rights Watch recognizes the legitimacy of public institutions seeking not to promote any religion via their conduct or statements. But the French government has taken this step further by suggesting that the state is undermining secularism if it allows students to wear religious symbols. So this is Human Rights Watch, a non-Muslim organization opposed to the ban which is being proposed in France. Now, Muslims should move to Muslim countries. Well, I mean, this of course is something which may not be practical at all. Of course, Muslims, wherever they find that practicing Islam becomes difficult, they are obliged to migrate, to make hijrah. This is an obligation which remains on Muslims until the last day. So the obligation to migrate is a general obligation which Muslims are faced with wherever they are. Even in Muslim countries where they have difficulty practicing Islam, they are obliged to migrate to another area where they can better practice Islam. As for the majority of Muslims, for example, in Western countries who cannot migrate, their responsibility is to try to implement Islam as best they can and to convey the message of Islam to the non-Muslim society in which they live. In case a woman is alone in her home, what clothing should she wear? Well, if she's absolutely alone, of course, she's free, she has to take a bath, whatever. I mean, people take baths, they don't usually wear clothing when they take baths, so it means that sometimes she may take off all of her clothing. So it depends on the circumstance, She doesn't have any particular minimum which is prescribed, but for herself, whatever she feels, most comfortable within the bounds of her own personal modesty, then she is permitted to wear as she wishes within the bounds of her own home when she's alone. What is the exact way of wearing the veil? This is the same question we looked at earlier. What is the sin for not wearing hijab? Well, of course, this is disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah Almighty. Women who expose themselves, depending on the severity of the case, could end up it being a source of punishment for them on the Day of Judgment, in the hellfire to some degree, for some period of time or whatever. It just depends on the severity of their acts. But in general, a Muslim is required to try to obey Allah's commands as much as they can. The nature of women and men are different. Isn't it also the nature or the way a man is created according to the Quran as one of the reasons why men look at women in desirous ways? Yes, it is from the nature of men that they are more easily aroused by females, just looking at them, etc. It is part of the difference. And this is why Allah, when speaking about the covering, says, tell the men, Muslim men, the believing men, that they should lower their gaze and guard their private parts. They're told. As women are told, they're also told. Question 2, is this conforming by other countries, the banning of the hijab for Muslims, a sign that non-Muslims are fearful of Islam? Yes, it does represent something of a fear. They see in Islam this wearing of the hijab a fundamentalist upsurge, and they link it to terrorism, which of course is a false link, because fundamentalism, going back to the fundamentals of Islam, is something required of all Muslims. And this has no link with terrorism. Terrorism is something else. A person may be an atheist and a terrorist. He could be, a Muslim who is not practicing Islam and he's a terrorist. It doesn't necessarily link with practicing Islam. So it's a misunderstanding on the part of many people in the West, unfortunately promoted by the media, that fundamentalism means terrorism. If women wear complete hijab, covering the face, then identification will be difficult, as per the Prophet saying that they should be identified when she goes with a man. Well, I don't know about that saying. In fact, the idea is that she is not identifiable, easily identifiable. It is sufficient that she knows who her husband is and where they have to meet. It is not necessary that the husband be able to identify his wife, when she is amongst other women in a similar dress. This is not a necessity. Some parents say, I will leave it up to my daughter to decide. What do you have to say to them? Well, this is a mistake. This is a mistake. It is something which Allah has already decided. So to say I will leave it up to my daughters to decide is to go against the commandment of Allah, is to give the right of decision which belongs to Allah to your daughter. This is a big mistake. Of course, many Muslims who are not applying Islam properly find themselves in a difficult situation when they recognize culturally that a girl has now become a young woman and she needs to be covered, and they ask her to cover and she doesn't want to. They have to struggle with this. Then they say, okay, I'll leave it up to you. But the reality is that the Prophet ﷺ said, teach your children prayer by the time they're 7. عَلِّمُوا أَوْلَادَكُمُ الصَّلَاةِ بِسَبْعٍ. Teach them prayer by the time they're 7. Teaching them prayer involves teaching them hijab. Because to teach a young girl how to pray, it doesn't mean the physical actions alone. It means the dress that it accompanies it. That she must cover herself accordingly what is acceptable for prayer. And she learns that dress from the time she's 7. By the time she reaches puberty, you'll not have any problems encouraging her to wear the hijab, because she'll already be doing it. Maybe not as complete, maybe at that time she wears it in the most complete sense. So that only becomes a problem for those people who are not following the prophetic instructions. How long would it take for Arab women to take off the hijab, going at the present trends? Well, I'm not a fortune teller, so I really can't give you an answer to that one. And in any case, you know, these trends are cyclic. If we were to go to Egypt, for example, 60 years ago, you would hardly find any woman wearing a scarf. Hardly find it. Today, you can't go anywhere without finding women wearing scarves. When I was in Malaysia in the 60s, I lived in East Malaysia, which is a Muslim country, I never saw a single woman in hijab. Not a single woman. Not one. Even, I found myself, when I went to Medina to study, during Hajj, and I saw these women that looked like the women of Malaysia, all covered up, you know, except for their face and hands. I asked some friends of mine, where are these people from? You know, because they look like Malaysia. They said, Malaysia. I said, what? I never saw anybody dressed like that in Malaysia. You know, because what they would do, they knew that when you pray you had to cover yourself. They would carry these garments in bags when they go to the mosque, and then when they get inside they'd put it on and they'd pray in it and put it back in the bag and leave. So I never saw it the whole time I was there in Malaysia. Now when I went back in the 90s, it was everywhere. The schools, the public places, everywhere. So even if you may find a society leans at one point towards a relaxing, the overall trend of Islamic awakening will help it come back in line. So I don't fear for the future in that regard. Question: you speak of extremes in the West, topless, miniskirt, etc. But are gloves, niqabs to the point where women cannot see, etc., not extreme as well? Why can there not be a respectful middle ground of conservative, modest dress? Thank you. Well, the degree to which a woman covers herself, if she chooses to cover herself to the point, as you said, where she can't see well, I mean, of course, that may be a bit of an extreme, you know, where it's going to hinder your walking, you're bumping into poles and falling and tripping and things like this. So we say this is an extreme, you should at least have a minimum of being able to maneuver in society, right? So, but still, even with the niqab and the glove, we can't say niqab and the glove is extreme. If it is sanctioned by the religion and a woman chooses to do so, then that is her option. There is no harm coming from it to the society or to herself. There's no harm coming from it to the society and to herself. In fact, one recent study, a doctor I was reading talking about societies where women wear the face veil have fewer incidences of nose and throat infections because it acts as a screening out. So there's benefits, in fact. Now if we go to the other extreme, you know, where people, the topless and the miniskirt, we say there's harm, there's obvious harm there, you know. So where are we going to find the modest means? Okay, what do you consider modest? What you consider modest, another person may not consider modest. You know? So we have difficulties. If it's left to the individual to decide, then we have problems. This is why, as Muslims, we say, leave it to God. Let God decide. Because we really don't know what's best for us. So this is the Islamic approach to it. As I said, abuse of women, you know, harassment of women in general, sexual harassment of women, which sometimes may reach the point of rape, but many other times it's not to that point. We do, common sense does tell us that this is going to be related to clothing. This is just basic. For a person to say, no, it has nothing to do with clothing. If I wear a bikini, it's not going to excite men. And in fact, if I wear a complete covering, you can't see anything of me, that might even excite them. Yes, there may be a man excited by that. But all men are excited by the bikini. That's reality. You know, let us not fool ourselves. Okay, our time's running out. We have hit the hour of 10 o'clock. And though we have a number of questions remaining, what I can do is maybe I'll save them for the center. We can answer them at the Qatar Guest Center, where we have regular classes in the evening. I have regular Friday classes there. I can answer some of them in my question and answer period, because time will not permit going through all of them. And if you didn't receive a brochure before leaving, please collect one, which informs you about the Qatar Guest Center, which is the main body involved with setting up this program. And inshallah we'll be having other public programs. We hope that you will continue to take part. Okay, just running through a few of these other questions. Is it permissible for children of the age 13 and 14 to wear hijab, that is the head cover, only at school, where the girls and the boys are separate? The hijab doesn't cover the chest. Well, you know, 13, 14 is the age of puberty, so a proper hijab should be worn by a girl of that age. The point at which it becomes a requirement, an obligation, religious obligation, is the age of puberty. In your speech you mentioned that there in the U.S. there's around 400 people converting to Islam daily in the U.S. Is there proof in this comment? Yes, it is research done by Yvonne Haddad from the University of Michigan and Ihsan Baghbi, both Professor Ihsan Baghbi, both of them concluded with these figures close to that 300 plus, etc. To me, TV media plays an important role in unveiling the women. If you provide liquor to a drunkard and then you tell him not to drink, it is very difficult for him. First ban the liquor, then tell him not to drink. Similarly, ban those TV channels which inspire women to unveil and then tell them, I guess, to veil. Well, we should, of course, try to control the media to the degree that we are able, but even if the media is not in our hands and it is not complying with Islamic principles, does that now become justification for us not to comply with those principles? Of course not. In the end, a person has an obligation to worship God, to obey the commandments of God in his or her life, whether the whole society doesn't do it or whether they do. Ultimately, they will be asked about themselves, first and foremost, and as such, they should consider the obligation a personal obligation. The implementation of Islam is a personal requirement. Then it is one of family, community, and society, etc. But first and foremost, we must begin with and end with ourselves, because we have to answer, each and every one of us, to God. With that, I'll close thanking you all for being with us this evening, and hoping that you will continue to take part in our various programs that we are offering. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.